All eyes around Washington this week as Prime Minister Mark Carney met with U.S. President Donald Trump inside the Oval Office. With Canada's economy at stake, the country collectively held its breath and watched.
Really want to congratulate him. It was probably one of the greatest comebacks in the history of politics. And I think Canada chose a very talented person, a very good person.
Is there anything he could say to you in the course of your meetings with him today that would get you to lift tariffs on Canada?
No.
Why not?
Just the way it is.
Part of the way you've conducted these tariffs has taken advantage of existing aspects of USMCA.
We don't do much business with Canada from our standpoint. They do a lot of business with us.
We are the largest client of the United States in the totality of all the goods. So we are the largest client of the United States.
When you get rid of that artificially drawn lines, when you look at that beautiful formation, I do feel it's much better for Canada.
As you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
But never say never. Never say never.
Okay, so now that Carney has visited the heart of power in the United States, he will now decide who sits at the table with him here in Ottawa. As next Tuesday, the Prime Minister will name his cabinet and the Governor-General will swear them in at Rideau Hall. So let's kick off there with our party insiders. Greg McEachern is a former Liberal ministerial advisor. Fred Delory is a former Conservative campaign manager. And Melanie Richer is a former communications director for the NDP. Quite the week. Mel, let's start with you. Your thoughts on the optics and the theater that we saw playing out in that very gold-filled Oval Office earlier this week.
Yeah, you know what? I'll give credit where credit is due. I think a lot of folks who were watching Prime Minister Carney this week thought that, perhaps they sent the right person to deal with President Trump, despite, President Trump continuing to repeat the never say never or still the 51st state stuff. But I think for a lot of folks, it was the first sigh of, okay, maybe we've got somebody there who's going to be able to manage this and manage it appropriately. I was talking to some folks who are U.S.-based who were asking what else would have Canadians wanted out of that meeting, and I said, for the president to never again mention the 51st state stuff, and of course we didn't see that, but again, the first sigh of, okay, we've got somebody who seems to be potentially able to manage this. I think the next step is, does it matter? Do we go back to he says something a little bit crazy, sorry, I was looking for a different word, not the up and down stuff.
Transformative, I think, is the word. They've settled on.
No kidding. That was a good one. And I think now it's just like where it goes from here. Does it stay a little bit more stable? Do we see him not tweet, but put out those messages every now and again when he's unhappy? I think that's kind of the next step that folks are looking for.
But Greg, Pete Hoekstra, the incoming U.S. ambassador to Canada, he did say in an interview with the National Post, 51st state, we're done with that. The president's going to raise it because he thinks it's a good idea, but is no longer, I guess, under active consideration through military or economic coercion. So here we are. Where do you think we are on Friday?
Yeah, I mean, in the clip that you played, President Trump talked about the artificially drawn border. Well, that's most borders. The U.S. has a tremendous history in Europe. There once upon a time there was West and East Germany, and there was Berlin, and there was Korea. There's lots of examples. I know he's not talking about any dissolution of any current states in the United States that would also be artificially drawn. So it is, kind of a bit silly. I noted the new ambassador's comment on that. There's, it's done. You're going to hear more about it, but it's done. So I thought that was a pretty effective message. And also, I think, we saw some effective messaging in the clip you showed of Prime Minister Carney, and a lot of people have talked about it this week. I noticed a couple of conservative voices that seem to be very upset that Carney didn't pick a fight or Trump didn't Zelensky him, but that's a pretty minute amount of commentary. Mostly everybody else, like Mel just said, we're pretty happy with this, and I think it's really interesting because there's almost like a Venn diagram of Mark Carney and Donald Trump, and in the middle that conversation where Prime Minister Carney, at first, it's a bit of flattery or acknowledgement of President Trump's background around real estate. And you watch, Trump starts to nod. And he says, some things are never for sale. Right. And I tense, and you were in the room, you and Tana McCharles were here last night, you were talking about how tense everyone was. But the president starts to nod, and he says, this building. and he elicits a laugh out of Trump, and then he says Buckingham Palace, and there's a little bit more to that because we suspect that Trump has a bit of a affection or pays attention.
He likes the royals.
He likes the royals,
and the King's coming here in a couple of weeks.
I'll draw a line to that, to King Charles doing our speech from the throne, and then he talks about I met with the owners of Canada, and that is not something you usually hear the voting public described, but in real estate terms, I think it was really effective. And in a very short, couple of sentences, I think Carney really landed extremely well.
Yeah, I mean, look, the mantra Fred in the election campaign was elbows up, but that doesn't mean you go in and hit the president with a folding chair in the Oval Office, right? It means you stand firm and interject. Well, yeah, I mean, 80s wrestling, right? The Piper's Pit type
they
thing,
wanted
right?
The elbow drops off the couch.
Yeah.
It didn't happen. No, I thought Carney handled himself pretty well. He clearly plays Trump very well.
Oh, God.
There's something going on here, like the conversation they had the first week of the campaign where Trump put out this, like, he called him prime minister in a tweet right after, which was, a big development, given he was calling our former prime minister.
It's ridiculous that it is, but it was.
It is, absolutely agreed. But it's amazing. Like, Carney is figured out the words that work with Trump. We talk about narrative and stuff a lot on this show because it's valuable. And Carney clearly has the right narrative with Trump when he has these private conversations. And I'd love to be able to listen in, but obviously none of us should because it's about advancing Canadians' interests, and those are private conversations. But even on the couch or on the chairs in the office there when they were talking, he had a good use and command of the words. He was able to push back on some of Trump's things, the 51st state, in a very respectful way that kind of played to Trump, but made very clear where he stood. So I thought he did very, very well.
It was interesting because it was about 35, 40 minutes, the whole event. And there was at one point like a 13-minute gap where Carney didn't speak, right? That it was just all Trump. So he dominated in time speaking and words spoken. But I use the same word you use, command, is that Carney knew what he wanted to interject on. He didn't litigate about the $200 billion and all these things, but he redirected them forcefully on sort of the core points of principle for Canada, it seemed to me. And his interjections were the ones that really sort of resonated beyond the meeting, it seemed.
Absolutely. And Trump, I think at the same time, his ego was involved in this election.
Right.
Yeah.
He did not want Pierre Poilievre to win. He did not want someone who is another conservative who didn't kiss the ring. Who didn't bow down and play that up, because there was lots of discussion of that. There was lots of criticism, I think, south of the border that didn't happen.
I'm not sure I totally buy that because there were so many people around Trump, like Elon Musk, that were praising Poilievre. There was a lot of
that was before Trump became. Once Trump became prime minister, the gears shifted, or president, sorry, or maybe premier, I should say. But as soon as Trump got in there and got into power, and these guys really got closer to him, they kind of lost interest in Poilievre. And when Poilievre wasn't, Trump has said so himself that Poilievre didn't show him it's not words respect, but he didn't.
Well,
ask for his advice.
It could have been a choice. Mark Carney could have taken a page out of Poilievre's book and sat down and said, "Hey, knock it off." That was Poilievre's approach to Trump during the election. 4 different times he said, "I'd tell the president to knock it off." Well, Mark Carney chose a different route. I think we're all glad that he did.
Well, what I took from Trump there was his delight in having played a significant role in the outcome. No matter who had won it, it was because of what I said and what I did, right? And there seems to be this view, and look, Trump analysis, take this for what it's worth, that because Carney's part of that sort of economic elite globally, Trump kind of likes that and admires that. But that's all fine. He liked Justin Trudeau right up until he didn't like Justin Trudeau. Right? What matters is that there's still tariffs. Yep. He's still talking about the auto sector even in that meeting. And we're at the start of a process, but nowhere near the end of it just yet. And that's what really matters beyond the theater of an Oval Office sit-down.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, that there's still, this is like, you talked about going from governor to prime minister being a win, and like, how is that a win? But it was, right? It was like the first sigh of relief. So I think this is probably the first test for Prime Minister Carney 2.0 of however many days he had before he went into the election. But there's so much more to come. This is barely, day one as it relates to President Trump. But I do think what was interesting, and you kind of picked on on the real estate comments, the comments that I picked up on are we're your biggest client. And if you're talking to somebody who's in business, like, you're not going to screw around with that. So the not having to, go head to head with him on the $200 billion stuff, but reinforcing in different ways by saying, we are your biggest client. I thought that was clever.
And arguing over the $200 billion number, that's going to get you nowhere. It's just going to derail the whole thing.
And we've seen, and we've talked about this around this table before, of like, how do you appease someone who's not looking to be appeased? And I think what we saw from Carney is, kind of dealing with Trump's ego a little bit without caving to the things that Canadians don't want him to cave to. And I thought I thought that was clever. I hope that it continues. To your point, he liked Prime Minister Trudeau until he didn't.
Yeah.
I do think, though, that the instinct to get in a fight just to get in a fight, I don't know that we're going to see that from Carney like we used to with Trudeau. And the parallel that I'm thinking about is, what does the House look like? I think we talked about this last week. What does the House look like with the Liberals and the Conservatives? I think, Trudeau used to like to kind of throw it back to Poilievre. I don't know that Carney will be the same way, and I think the dynamic is kind of similar.
Well, he won't be for a while.
Yeah, well, there's that too. I think it'll be a similar, I don't need to take the shot just to take a shot. I think is the difference.
I want to just quickly move to the cabinet thing, and I'm not taking a shot at the New Democrats here, but it's a bit like the don't invite him to the G7 demand. That's cathartic, but it's not strategic. Totally. It creates problems. So, making a show up of the president in that meeting might make you feel good, but it gets you nowhere in the bigger picture, and it puts a lot of things at risk. So, look, let's just talk about the cabinet, because we found out today it's going to come Tuesday morning. I don't want to. Tuesday, 10:30. What I'm being told, Greg, is that, look, you're probably going to see a bigger cabinet than what you had in the interim period. It's obviously going to be gender balanced, as the Prime Minister has promised. What I've had confirmed to me is that one of the other options looking at is a tiered structure. It's sort of an inner circle of senior cabinet that would meet frequently and regularly and deal with the big issues, and an outer tier of more ministers of state that would meet less frequently and wouldn't necessarily be part of almost like an executive structure of cabinet. The Brits kind of do it this way. I think Harper kind of did it this way, like a cabinet of 26 and a ministry of 40, with ministers of state.
Yeah.
What are you expecting to see coming next week from Mark Carney on this? Because he's got a lot more people to choose from, and kind of he holds all of the cards after what happened on the 28th.
Yeah, and I believe under Chrétien we had Secretary of States, Minister of States.
Yeah, these sorts of things.
Look, in the interests of time, I won't sugarcoat this. Although the Trudeau government tried to say that all cabinet ministers were equal, the reality is we know that that's not true. There's obviously some portfolios that touch on more urgent, important items to Canadians' lives from day to day. And sometimes, from quarter to quarter, those ministers may change. If there's, a health crisis like the pandemic, all of a sudden procurement is a bigger issue. So I think it's kind of, if I'm sure your reporting is true, David, I think that's good. It's realistic. It also allows people that do not have as much experience as, say, some other politicians to get, a start at the cabinet table, and you get to see folks they get the opportunity to prove their mettle. I think what Prime Minister Carney has to balance is a number of things: gender balance, regional balance, the basics that always go in. He's also got a couple of high-profile candidates that are coming in that I would expect to see in cabinet. It would be very awkward if you have been relying on, say, a certain core group when you were Prime Minister during the election. You might say travel to Washington with them. What roles will they have? So there's a lot to balance there. And look, there's an old chestnut. Those who know don't talk. Those who talk don't know. So we'll see.
Well, these people know and talked. But
I'm talking about myself. I know. My little role.
But Fred, the inner circle of cabinet is how it functions in practice, whether it's done that way in structure. But he seems like a more focused, smaller agenda item list kind of Prime Minister. I'm told he likes a smaller table, and this seems to be the sort of thing that gives you a more focused agenda, move with urgency, because I think there's going to be a lot of centralized control, but to give her propulsion rather than to slow things down from this PMO.
Absolutely. It's a good sign to have a tighter, more focused cabinet that can focus on the issues. When you get a big cabinet, like at the end of the Trudeau regime, you had so many cabinet ministers that had no actual departments or deputy ministers. They were titles. They weren't actually doing anything, but they were still sitting around the table weighing in without actually having the...
and no levers to pull when they left the meeting, right?
There was just, it wasn't a good setup. If you go back to a system that's tiered, even if you have senior cabinet ministers with ministers of state or secretaries of state who have at least mandates carved out that they need to focus on. And it does seem to be all accounts that Carney wants to focus on that and actually be results driven, not announcement driven like the previous government. Now, he set an agenda. He had a press conference last week where we went over, where he made lots of very solid points about what he wants to get done when, and we'll have to see if he can do that. But I do expect a much more focused cabinet from everything that everyone's hearing about.
Yeah, and Mel, I mean, he laid out 4 priorities in that press conference, 2 that he ran on and 2 that Poilievre ran on, right? Like Trump, the economy, public safety, and affordability, and a leaner, tighter, more focused. It might be a bigger cabinet than it is now, but I think it'll have a sharper point to it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I do think that there was some blowback to him, when he named his cabinet before, when he got rid of the
status of women.
The status of, exactly, when he got rid of labor as part of a minister. I think that those things, I'm sure he heard about it on the election trail because we definitely did. So I think we'll probably see a return to that, and labor will be important if we continue to have tariffs and we see job losses. So those 2 things I would hope, I guess, as a Canadian, that those come back. I also think that, and this is going to be a new government, but by the time the Prime Minister had shuffled his cabinet in December, it almost took until March until those ministers were in the roles, that folks were in the jobs and ready to do stuff. If you are facing Trump, if you've got, let's say 18 months and you bring in a bunch of new people and a bunch of new roles, there's also a learning curve there. If it's the folks that have bigger profile but who've never, been an elected person, like what's that curve? We've got some pressing issues that we need action on now, and that's, the signal that we've heard from Prime Minister Carney. What does that look like with folks who have never done these roles before? I think is going to be important.
So given that, how big do you think the change will be? Right? You
also have to be different than Trudeau. So how do you, right? Like those are.
Well, does he now
both sides out of my mouth? But I'm not a liberal, so I get to.
Yeah, but is that as big an imperative now that he's won an election?
I think so.
I think it is because if not, you have all these cabinet ministers that were there for the Trudeau era. That was all about the announcement and not actual getting the productivity and getting things done. And if Carney's real focus is actually moving things, I think he needs ministers that can, actually move things. And there was no sign that the previous government did that. There'll be a couple, I'm sure, that will remain. But he needs he's recruited all these new MPs too that won.
Yeah.
So,
but I also just quickly, I also think that, of course, the Liberals won a lot of seats. The big reason that we heard is because Trump was so scary to a lot of people, right? If Trump is no longer a player the next time we go to an election, and folks, we're still just as upset with the Liberals in this election. We saw it in the Conservative numbers. Those are still things that you're going to have to deal with come next time. And if Trump isn't, this big threat, if he doesn't separate himself from Trudeau, if he doesn't show that he can actually get stuff done, I think that record is still going to be around for sure.
Craig, your thoughts on that? Then we're going to take a break and switch topics.
I want to apply Fred's logic about using people from a previous time to Andrew Scheer for a second. I mean, if that's...
We're going to talk about the Conservatives in a second. Let's stick with the cabinet and what's going to happen. But do you expect, he's got Tim Hodgson, he's got Claude Gay, he's got Carlos Leitao, he's got Gregor Robertson. He's got a bunch of people. He's got Alberta MP, Saskatchewan MP, and Buckley Boulanger. I mean, do you think he makes half of it new, or what do you think, ratio-wise?
And again... I do not have an inner circle source on this, but some folks in government have suggested that he would probably need around 50% of new faces to kind of bring in some new blood. And look, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I wonder if you retired but then unretired, does that count as new? I don't know. We'll have to find out. All right, we're going to take. It's a good question.